You're listening to Ingenuism's Silicon Valley Examined, where we delve into how the tech industry is helping create progress at the speed of thought. I'm Don Watkins. With me, as always, is Robert Hendershott. All right, Robert, how's it going?
It's going great, Don. How are you doing?
Good. So we're going to dive right in. Last week, we talked with Yaron Brook about winners of Ingenuism, and I thought we could continue that conversation. But particularly, I think one of the most interesting insights you've had is that there's a certain kind of company that is poised to benefit most from ingenuous principles. So why don't we start there, and we can then go into kind of specific companies, or maybe even there's industries that this is relevant to.
I think you can see if you look historically that companies that have embraced connection and exploration have always done particularly well. And what we're seeing now is that that's just on steroids, that the level of connection that's possible and the new ways that people think about exploration, because it's not just exploring, it's exploring intelligently and knowing when to backtrack and knowing when to take another branch on the trail, as it were, that gets you the great results from exploration. So it's not just wandering around aimlessly. But I think that what we're seeing, and where I see it the most is in the stock market, where you see these trillion-dollar companies just popping up like virtually overnight from the perspective of how long it used to take to build a leading company. That there's the potential for all sorts of companies to really be embracing and getting similar results, but you see it mostly concentrated in Silicon Valley and in particular types of technology companies, because I think it's easier. It's easier to introduce exploration when it's already part of the culture. It's easier to embrace failure when other people are also embracing failure. And it's easier to experiment and explore when you're working in a digital world. There's just less, that the hurdle is lower to really try something out. So we've seen a big change in Silicon Valley over the last 20 years. In a lot of other sectors, not so much.
It reminds me of a story from Andrew Carnegie where he has a steel factory that's almost built, which you can imagine how much time and money that takes. And one of his colleagues says, I actually have a way that we could make the factory even more efficient. And so they scrap the entire factory and build a brand new one. And you just it tells you so much about Carnegie, but it also reveals, I think, or it's striking how much different that is from, yeah, this software isn't working, let's go in another direction. Like, the cost of making that change is so much lower and can therefore be much more speculative, right? It can be, I think we can take this other approach that might be 10 times as better. It might not be, but you're not scrapping an entire factory and investing in an entire new one. And so I think it speaks to your point about the way in which you can really double down on ingenuous principles in a digital world in a way that is much harder in the world of atoms.
Well, it definitely seems much harder. And I think that that's often used as, I don't know if excuse is the right word, but a justification for not taking those same leaps. And it may be true, but it's probably not. It is probably the case that if we started to explore how can we really leverage this level of connection and the ability to explore and learn quickly, even in areas that it doesn't seem like it's a natural fit, that we would find ways. We'd find ways to do that. And there are companies that have done that in the past. And I don't see any reason why they need to be the exception. They could be the rule.
Now, even within Silicon Valley and tech companies, one point I've heard you make that I think is certain, at minimum plausible, but I think ultimately potentially profound, is that platforms in particular, companies that in effect specialize in connection, are really poised to win from ingenuous principles.
Yeah, it's always been that the big winners are those that create something that other people can build upon. The when I say big winners, whether or not that's captured by the original inventor is more questionable. But the big winners from in terms of progress and really adding to the world. But there's a there's a tendency to think that that's the only way to do it. You can introduce the idea of a smartphone and then keep running as fast as you can so you can be the leading smartphone company, and then you end up with a $2 trillion market capitalization. But you can also leverage off of that new platform, or you could be working in a non-platform, even a non-digital world. So I think that the biggest winners are definitely those that have embraced the latest innovations that are really fundamental to how business is done and how people interact. And so if you just look at the list of the biggest, most valuable companies, they've all leveraged the internet, they've all leveraged the smartphone, they've all are leveraging data and data analytics. And that is definitely where the biggest winners are. But building on those platforms produces some really interesting companies as well. If you look at the companies that have created either in the background the tools to manage the infrastructure that runs the world today, so a lot of cloud computing companies, or if you look at companies that are building more on the retail in the foreground, companies like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb that are taking advantage of the fact that everyone's carrying around this powerful computer that's connected 24/7. You could just get a lot of different ways that the basic principles of Ingenuism end up creating really valuable, really interesting, and really impactful companies.
How do you think about a company like Amazon? Because from one perspective, they built on this amazing platform of the internet, and they were one of the first people to really get it right. But on the other hand, there's a way in which now they've become the store that sells other stores, right? So if I want to sell my trinkets and my widgets, like I'm going to put them on Amazon's platform. And so do you see them more as, building on a platform, being a platform, or is this kind of like a fascinating hybrid case?
It's definitely the fascinating hybrid because, Amazon started out with that key insight that the way that retail was valued and what the constraints were going to be fundamentally different in a digital world. We've talked about this before, that shelf space, which was always the constrained resource. So you were always trying to figure out how to get the right product on the right shelf at the right time because you had limited shelf space and you had limited access to your customers' attention. That was Jeff Bezos's big insight, is that would no longer be the case. That now it was going to be, where can I go to get everything I need? Where can I go to get the best selection, the best prices, the best customer service? Who can give it all to me? And that retail was going to look a lot more like you had melded the stores and the malls. And so it was pretty obvious once you have that insight, and it's not an obvious insight. I mean, in hindsight, it looks like it, but it took, retail dominant players like Walmart years to really get it. Once you have that, then it makes sense to invite what would ostensibly be your competitors in. It helps, I'm sure, to have come from outside of retail, because it'd probably make your brain explode if you had to think about giving your competitors shelf space on your store. But that's what Amazon did. So it became a platform for everybody to sell everything, not quite in the same way that eBay was, although Amazon tried to compete in that area. They never really got any traction. But in the fixed price, find exactly what you need, not so much unique items. But then there was all this other stuff going on, like reconstituting how books are published, because having a centralized publishing industry with literally a couple dozen people controlling which books get published. When I say controlling, there's nothing nefarious about that. They were just the gatekeepers, and somebody had to make the decisions. And the historical method was you've got these very powerful editors that make those decisions. Well, that makes a ton of sense in a world of scarcity, where you can only publish so many books and there are only so many shelves that you have to put those books on. But in a digital world, it makes no sense to limit content. In fact, you're going to deliver more value to your customers, and you're going to make more money if you can expand the amount of content. So creating the Kindle ecosystem, so another platform inside of the retail bookstore, so that you have more books and books more easily accessible. And of course, then now you're tapping your customers' creativity and their desire to write books, and you're not just looking for people who are passive consumers. And then, of course, you have the streaming side of the business. You have Amazon is dominant in streaming video games, not just streaming video. You have the whole back end, the AWS piece. So, we could spend, and maybe we should sometime, we could spend an hour just talking about Amazon and what the lessons for people who want to take advantage of Ingenuism are. But it is a very complicated, hybrid, Frankenstein type of case that most of these really dominant, really successful companies don't look anything like. They're typically very deep, very heavy into one particular area. And then that's why they're so successful. Amazon's more like your historical conglomerate that, historically wasn't very successful, but Amazon seems to be pulling it off.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed is like a lot of businesses get like, it'd be great to be the platform where everybody comes. And there's kind of the obvious battles of like, Facebook versus what was its precursor?
MySpace
Versus its precursor, Friendster. But particularly during the Web 2.0 era, there was a real battle where it was, okay, well, I'm going to create my platform, and it would be these kind of like niche sites. Like, this is where people who are interested in knitting get together. And what we've largely seen is that there's some of that, particularly, I think, more in the B2B professional world. But in general, people prefer kind of these open-ended platforms, at least in the social media world. And so like it's really hard to build something that connects people in a way that they actually find valuable and that outdoes your competitors, precisely because there's such a high upside to getting it right.
It's definitely true. There's a really strong network effect. So people think, if I can just get past critical mass and get all of the knitters to come to my site, then I'll be able to dominate. But that ignores the fact that connection is never that siloed. I mean, people who knit are then going to be interested in different types of yarn and the way that yarn is dyed, and maybe in crochet, or maybe it's very hard to keep people satisfied when you silo them. So you tend to get these platforms where people can find their connections, but they're not limited to what they originally came for. And you see that in eBay, you see that in Amazon, you see that in particular in Facebook. And I think that Facebook is a great example because it looked at the beginning like the way to focus, to compete with Facebook would be to focus on vertical and give those particular people a better experience than they get on Facebook generally, because you're really catering to them. And that's all true, except it misses out on the spillovers and the overlaps between silos that you don't have and you might not have imagined would really be that important and valuable. And so where you've seen a lot of success in, I'll call it competing with Facebook, is by offering not what Facebook does only in a narrower sense, but offering something that enhances the connection that people have already revealed they're looking for on Facebook, the ability to share, the ability to have a curated stream of information and context coming in. And so you see companies like Instagram, of course, Instagram is part of Facebook now, but if Instagram had stayed that stayed independent, they would be a place that people would go for both connecting with those things, those people and those things that they really want to connect with, and they know they want to connect with, but also to discover other connections. Definitely Snapchat is offering that sort of experience, and got their traction and packaged critical mass by offering it in a different way than Facebook was offering it. TikTok is an obvious example and a really cool example because it's just the epitome of what's possible when you are embracing ingenuist principles, because there you're experimenting with how do you feed people what they want. You're giving them a platform, but platforms are always a challenge, because if you're successful, you're going to have a massive amount of content being put on the platform. And if people can't discover what they really want, if they're not getting what they want, if they're getting just random stuff like that I would want, they're going to leave very quickly. And so where you have seen a lot of success isn't I'm going to get narrow. Rather, I'm going to be big, broad, give people what they want, but in a way that is new and exciting and somehow a little bit different or better.
Yeah, I mean, I think about how message boards were basically wiped out by Reddit, right? Like back in the day, it was all of these independent message boards that you would discover, and they'd be organized usually around a topic or something like that. And the Reddit said, "Well, no, we're just going to own every topic, and you can live here and bounce between topics." And I think the it's much more oriented to how people actually are, right? Like you talked about the spillover effects, but part of it is I want to go to one place where all of my interests will be there, reminding me, hey, you can, engage in a political debate. You can learn about the latest novel in the sphere that you like, rather than like, oh, I got to remember to check 20 different places for my 20 different interests, some of which might have waned. And it won't even be on my radar screen. Whereas it's in these kind of central universes that we live in, the connection is just more among people, and the interests are kind of like just ways of organizing my interaction with other people.
Yeah, exactly. They never know exactly what they want. We often think we do, but then we discover it, and it ends up being a real win-win, because you stumble on a topic that you're just suddenly intrigued by that you wouldn't have maybe thought of if you weren't on Reddit or on Facebook or wherever it is that you are. And then, of course, you go down a rabbit hole of exploring that topic and getting involved in discussions. And that's really good for the platform business model, because they're looking for engagement. And the longer you're there and getting value from it, the better off the platform is.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit of an aside, but I was talking to, somebody who had worked at Facebook, because there's so much criticism of, like, in effect, the way that it'll be positioned is you're trying to get people addicted. And like Facebook really struggles with yeah, we want people on the platform, but what they try to do is assess, like, how much positive time are you spending? How many time meaningfully connected with the people and interests you care about? So there's this kind of, weird dichotomy of how, like, we really don't want to just be selling crack. We want to be selling, delicious, nourishing food that you keep coming back for. And but how do you measure that when it's much more straightforward just to see, oh, this keeps somebody hooked for hours. Um, that's probably worth exploring at some point. But I actually want to feel free to add thoughts to that. But I actually wanted to step back and say, what are like pre-digital precursors when we think about platforms that can give us some insight into what we're seeing today?
Well, platforms have existed as long as people have been, communicating and interacting economically. If you think about Visa and MasterCard, or you think about the banking system, these are the ways that people have, for decades now, uh, engaged in commerce. And then that just starts to change as you move from the centralized banking system to something that is more decentralized or just more fragmented. So you're offering these same kind of services to more types of businesses or more types of consumers, or you go full on into a crypto or a distributed finance world where the platform is now not a centralized, trusted, regulated authority, but it is a little bit more of the Wild West. And so anything that, if we look back, anything that people have coalesced around, whether it is economically or socially, that these are what were historically platforms. So, and a lot of the organizations that exist, the legacy organizations, whether they're banks or universities or local clubs, these were ways to create that same experience. And now we have it where that experience is available in, at least in theory, and I think more and more in practice, between every single one of these 7.5 billion people that are on the planet. And so you have Facebook and actually everybody trying to introduce a more of a truly virtual world, more of a sort of a Fortnite experience where the limits on what you're doing online start to disappear. Because it's really amazing if you think about where we were 25 years ago. Most people were unwilling or not interested in putting their credit card online.
I forgot.
And
Yeah. Well, I think people were nervous about the security. I just remember it was complicated. You couldn't figure out how to do it. And certainly it was hard to set up if you were on the receiving end. And then PayPal came along and suddenly it was like, oh, this is easy, feel safe. And I felt like overnight you could buy stuff on the internet.
it's suddenly changed. And if you think about 25 years ago on those message boards, everyone had a, a a handle. They had a stage name, as it were. Everything was anonymous. It was all asynchronous, and that's it definitely has its place. But synchronous communication is the core of what people are. And then you start to see things like ICQ come in, and of course with MySpace and Facebook, people just started to revealed their entire lives online. You never would have guessed that 25 years ago that this wouldn't be a parallel world. So it's actually already become sort of a distorted reflection of the real world. People are posting pictures of what they're doing all day. But in a virtual world, in a Fortnite world, it's the world, but put into a different medium.
Let me give you a funny example of that and get your reaction to this, because this was the most interesting explanation of the NFT craze that I've heard so far. So NFT is basically like you buy alleged, no, I shouldn't say alleged. What's the right? You buy like, a claim of ownership in effect to some piece of like some digital visual image. Everybody who's an expert in NFTs is laughing at me right now, but I'm trying to explain it in kind of a common sense way. But in any case, this is baffling why anybody would do it to many people, because the idea is like, well, it's not like everybody can look at the image the same way that like I can go to a website and see the pictures on Wikipedia. What is this like ownership by you? And so the entrepreneur and business coach Gary Vaynerchuk, what he argued is that like, why do people spend $25,000 on a watch, right? You're communicating in effect. The way he put it is, you can't run up to somebody in the street and like tell them, hey, I have $10 million in my bank account, but you can wear this $25,000 watch and you can drive this $500,000 car. But now that we're living digital lives, like what does conspicuous consumption and signaling look like? And he thinks that it's, oh, here's my library of NFTs, just like my, library of wall art. And it's in effect an outgrowth of the fact that this digital life that people are living is taking on more and more reality and importance.
I think that's definitely true. And it's an interesting segue into sort of what progress is going to look like in this world. Who the big winners are that people are going to be deft at living in and doing business in this new world. And it's hard for me to wrap my brain around it, because if you think about what has created value, what has created perceived value, is it always relates to scarcity. So the $25,000 watch only works if it stays at $25,000, so that not very many people can buy it, or the expensive car or the expensive house. But I think the direct analogy would be to art in the physical world, because people pay, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars for what is a little paper and a little paint. And some art is beautiful, and some art is beautiful in someone else's eyes, but none of it has any intrinsic value that is even close to what people will pay for it. And that is generally because it's scarce. If you look at a print of the Mona Lisa and you wanted to buy a print, it's inexpensive. If you wanted to buy the actual painting, it would be incredibly expensive. In fact, you can't even buy it. It's the scarcity is the thing that drives this status of ownership. And an NFT is by definition a scarce good, because it's on the blockchain. You have a unmutable claim to that which is, you have a claim, whatever that is. But creating NFTs is easy. And so the key is, how can you create something that is going to have scarcity value when everyone, and literally everyone who has any computer savvy, could create an NFT? So we could create an NFT of this podcast. And so how could we make it such that it would be worth something? That's what makes it really interesting, because we are going to replace a lot of the physical world with more digital items. That's been happening. It's going to continue happening, and it'll happen for status symbols as well. But it's not a direct one-for-one map. And so I'm really interested in how this evolves. Crypto is the same way, in that there isn't an inherent value. There's no, some big force with an army and taxing authority makes you use this crypto. It has to be embraced voluntarily. And you and I could create a digital currency. Like, there's sort of a near infinite supply of these things. So what is it that makes some of them extraordinarily valuable while most of them are completely worthless?
Yeah. And so, I mean, just to tie it to our larger conversation here. So, in effect, the platform would be what? The blockchain technology that then is given rise to all of these things that are being built on top of it. And we don't know kind of how that's all going to play out, but we're seeing these really interesting, innovative kind of uses. And indeed, we've written about even more speculative things that might happen in the future.
Yes, and it's very cool because it's largely transparent. So we all learn quickly what works, what doesn't work. And sometimes it's hard to figure out, why does this particular piece of art sell for $27 million, and there's all this other art that just languages. But we'll figure that out, and it'll allow people to create new valuable services, NFTs, fill in the blank. Whereas today we're just sort of guessing. It's almost like we're feeling around in the dark.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the powers of the fact of that these things can, one of the reasons that people, will be the first movers who will engage in this kind of moving around in the dark is because, if you do get it right on day one, the upside is just insanely big, right? Like the people, my friends who were telling me many, many years ago, hey, there's this thing called Bitcoin you should buy. And I scoffed at throwing away, 20, 30, $40 of my money for several Bitcoin, whatever the price was back at the beginning. Yet they are doing okay now, right?
Yes. See, I would have this enormous regret, because I would have definitely lost my personal key, but over the 10-year period, and then I would have hypothetically $100 million, but in practice, $0 million.
Yeah, that's definitely the worst case scenario that I can possibly imagine. Um, So in terms of then like how you think about, if you're trying to judge, where we're headed, is a lot of how you think about it sort of where, what are these new platforms being built and then what new potentials they unlock?
Definitely, that's if you want to figure out the biggest winners, the next trillion-dollar companies. But the reality is there's a ton that's going on at a much smaller level. And if you focus excessively at being the one that introduces the next big platform that gets adopted, then you can miss opportunities to use the existing platforms to make things a little better, add a new feature, or even to build a innovative culture that is continuously seeped in connection and exploration, that doesn't necessarily even use the internet as a primary source of value, or smartphones or data. Like, there are companies that are really good, and there are organizations that are really good at learning lessons and you know bringing either products to market that people want, or improving the products that they already have. I mean, we've written about the aviation industry and their success at having zero crashes over the last 14 years in the United States. So to turning flying into the safest form of travel, when you're literally tens of thousands of feet up in the air. But at the same time, airlines have also become very good at what's the right way to put it, at matching their costs and their revenues, at getting people to pay for the service in a way that gives them consistent profits. Now, COVID aside, we used to have, if you look back into the earlier days of the airline industry, you used to have periodic runs where basically everyone went bankrupt. So there would be a big addition to the number of planes because demand was high, and then the number of seats would outrun demand. And then, of course, you can only price at the margin for what people are willing to pay for the last seat. And then so prices would crater and everybody with Southwest would go bankrupt. That stopped happening because airlines finally had enough information and experience. They had explored enough different ways to make their business model work. And it's, of course, very frustrating for passengers, who are the ones who actually have to pay full fare. And I don't mean full business class. I mean, as a group, pay for keeping the industry afloat. And so, you end up with baggage fees, and you end up with fees to get a better seat, and you end up with fewer direct nonstop flights. But you end up with a industry that has figured out how to make its revenues consistently exceed its costs, and that's how you get progress. It doesn't feel like progress if someone else was paying for you to be able to fly from one city to another city at low cost. But it is progress compared to having all the airlines go out of business and us having to walk everywhere.
Um, One thing that you said in passing at the beginning, I think is really interesting. And I don't think we'll have like a fully worked out answer here, but it's that, exploration is not just trying stuff, right? Like companies flailing around and trying stuff because nothing's working and they're not winning. Like that's not kind of, oh, this company's really going to have a breakthrough because, they're following ingenuous principles. But there's the risk of, when we're looking at success, everything is obvious in hindsight, right? But it's really hard to get underneath. How can I tell when a company is really engaging kind of fruitful exploration when it hasn't paid off yet? And I I don't expect that there's a magic formula answer that would ever be discovered to that. But I'm curious as somebody who's really trying to think about that kind of question, where you even start to try to get a handle on it.
Well, if we use the exploration, like the physical exploration analogy, you're trying to get somewhere interesting. You might have a specific goal in mind. You're trying to find the fountain of youth. You're trying to get to the West Coast. But no matter what your goal is, you can measure progress, even if you haven't reached the goal. And that's what successful organizations do, is they are willing to evaluate in midstream and make course corrections, or maybe even turn around. Dealing with failure is a big part of this. But the willingness to, uh, as the example you gave, to tear down the mostly completed steel mill in order to build a much better one, that is something that is rare. It is common for people to become attached to the path that they're on, and to feel like if they were to move off that path, they would either be judged by others as having made mistakes and as a failure, or they would judge themselves that way. And that's a very powerful force for human beings. It feels very risky to explore, particularly if you haven't come to the cliff yet, even if you have the evidence that you're coming to the cliff. And so that it's a subtle, but it's a really important characteristic of these kind of organizations, is that they're exploring, but they're also looking to build a system, or to make this a process where they can evaluate as they go and make corrections, or even abandon things when the data or the evidence suggests it.
Something you said in there reminded me of one of my favorite movies, is Anthony Hopkins' movie called The Edge. And Hopkins plays this billionaire genius who gets stranded in the woods with, this hotshot younger guy played by Alec Baldwin. And you expect that as the billionaire genius, he's going to learn that, hey, your business skills don't count out here. But it turns out actually, like, his mind is what gets him out of there. But he says at one point to Alec Baldwin, he says, "Do you know why people die in the wilderness, Bob?" And Bob's played by Alec Baldwin says, "No." He says, "They die of shame." But it's that kind of like, I'm not willing to question the path that I've gone on and everything, because I'll have to kind of feel like an idiot. The very thing that can get me out of trouble, I'm unwilling to do.
I've not seen that movie, but I can absolutely hear Anthony Hopkins saying they die of shame, like,
Yeah.
in my mind. I think that one company that's worth talking about, and I know it's one that you've been looking at, is 3M, because 3M is not a digital platform. It's not even really a digital company. It's a company of the physical world. Yet they are really the example that you can point to pre-internet of a firm embracing ingenuous principles very, very successfully.
Well, they remind me a lot of Bell Labs in many ways. Now, Bell Labs had kind of the starting platform, right? Like, we have a phone monopoly, and we have to, like, create a whole bunch of cool stuff relevant on top of it and so on. But in the sense that it was something that was deliberately designed for innovation. Now, it didn't start that way. It started basically as a sandpaper company that said, "Hey, go out and sell some sandpaper." And one of their salesmen goes out and figures out, "Oh, I could actually take the kind of basics of sandpaper, which is paper and some adhesive, and use it for other uses that are solving problems of the customers." And so that becomes like the first thing that transforms them in the direction of saying, all right, what we're going to specialize in is breakthrough products that solve problems that people want solved. And so, it's led to all kinds of things, from masking tape and scotch tape were two of the early ones. More recently, they're in lithium ion batteries, touch screens, all the way to, kitchen sponges and things like that. But basically, the idea is what they focused on is what we're specializing in is not any of these goods, but the process that makes possible invention. And it was striking to me how much it was the very things that we talk about. So, exploration is an obvious one. One of the things that they do that I thought was fascinating is that like in Bell Labs, it wasn't you need to turn out something new tomorrow. It's try stuff out. You're gonna fail. We're gonna spread the stories of failure within the company to encourage it, and a big part of what we're going to do is connect you with other people in the company. So if their big breakthroughs have come from taking something that works in area A and connecting to something that seems completely unrelated in area D. So Scotch tape is a perfect example. There it was, all right, we have cellophane. Cellophane, what can we do with cellophane? That's kind of a cool product. Is, oh, we can make it sticky. And that becomes Scotch tape, right? But so they deliberately work to move people around the company. So you have researchers and scientists in different divisions. They have these big get-togethers where they're sharing research. And the thing I was going to say in exploration that they do is they're actually the ones who invented what Google became famous for, which is, hey, you should spend part of your workday working on whatever you want. Whatever you want, as long as you're sharing your findings with your colleagues, go out and do it. And of course, this became what Google did to create Gmail and Google Translate and a bunch of other things. But it's kind of giving people that space to explore, giving them a way to connect. And one of the interesting things that's happened with them in the pandemic, and I know you found this interesting, was here you might think that, okay, connection is going to be harder. So how do we maintain what we were doing? But they actually thought, how can we expand connection and collaboration? And so they actually started doing more collaboration with people outside the organization, sharing more information, in effect, treating them as extended, members of the company. So just their whole approach, I found really surprising, in that everybody tells you, like, find your niche and specialize. And their view is what we specialize in is creation, which is just such a fabulous business model. I'm it's interesting that nobody else that I'm aware of has really replicated that.
Well, there are a couple of things that I think jump out. One is you really have to instill a culture of trust to be able to have that level of exploration, willingness to fail, and collaboration. And frankly, most companies don't have that level of trust. And that would be, it's a core principle of Ingenuism. If you don't trust both in other people's ingenuity and also that the process will produce something even when you can't see the roadmap, then you're not going to explore. And if you don't trust that there's something good out there, you're never going to go off the path. And so that's one thing that, to your earlier question, that if you're looking at whether a company that has not yet shown the kind of results that a Google or a 3M has is really building that culture, is you'd be looking at, how much trust do they put in both their people and their process. And then the second thing that is really cool about what you were just talking about is you've got this company that is a paragon of innovation and is trotted out as the example of how you instill collaboration and cooperation, and you have time set aside and events to try and create serendipitous connections. And it's very easy to just say, oh, this is working, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so you find yourself doing things the same way that you were doing them 20 years ago, where the world and what's possible in the world has completely changed. And then it takes a pandemic to force you to take another look at, well, okay, we can't keep doing things exactly the way we've been doing them. If we were starting from scratch in this new world, with its constraints, but also with its opportunities, what would we want to do differently? And so even in a 3M where, I like you, I am really just amazed at what they've managed to produce, not by going really deep into a particular area, but by looking at lots and lots of potentially niche products, which some of which have become products that billions of people use on a daily basis, that even that company, even 3M, it's very easy to get complacent. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, where things are working and you're doing great, it's easy to treat like where you are as a ceiling. but it's not, particularly not today, where there are billions of more people, more minds available, and you can connect so closely to not just individuals, but companies all around the world.
Well, so we've been talking about platforms, but we've also mentioned that so much amazing work is the things that are done to build on top of them. So the platform that one of the platforms I'm most excited about is Substack. And in particular, I'm very proud of what we are building on top of it. So the best way to stay in touch with us is to go to our Substack at ingenuism.com. Robert, I will look forward to talking to you next week.
That was really deft, Don. I'm impressed. That was very nimble. All right. Take care.